After the release of Metal Gear Solid 5, the future of the franchise would be pretty uncertain. Shortly after the game's release, Hideo Kojima, along with the rest of the Kojima Productions team, would part ways with Konami for reasons that we still don't know with 100% certainty to this day, as neither party involved has spoken on the matter publicly. This was a really big deal, as despite the fact that Kojima had been involved with every single Metal Gear game up to this point outside of Snake's Revenge, Konami still held the legal rights to the IP. This meant that if they wanted to make more Metal Gear games, they would have to do so without Kojima for the first time in over 25 years. And they of course wanted to make more Metal Gear games, as it's the largest gaming IP they have access to. So when they sat down to decide what to do with the franchise next, someone in the room pitched a pretty interesting idea. Kojima himself had been talking about wanting to make a zombie game for quite a while leading up to his departure, and had even spoken to some of the designers at PlatinumGames about making a sequel to Metal Gear Rising that would see Cyborg Ninja Gray Fox fighting against nanomachine-powered zombies. So someone at Konami brought up the idea of making a zombie game within the Metal Gear universe, and that idea quickly turned into a brand new title for the franchise that would come to be known as Metal Gear Survive. But as I'm sure most of you already know, Metal Gear fans were not happy with this idea. As soon as the game was announced, fans were incredibly angry that Konami would get rid of Kojima and his team and then so quickly turn his beloved franchise into a generic zombie game. Reactions would then become even worse as fans found out that the game would heavily revolve around co-op multiplayer, recycle a ton of assets from Metal Gear Solid 5, have microtransactions, and even require a constant internet connection to even play the game. The game would eventually be released in February of 2018 and would see some of the lowest sales in the franchise's history, getting even less total sales than the NES port of the original Metal Gear back in the 80s. So all that begs the question. Does Metal Gear Survive really deserve to have such a terrible reputation and be completely written off by the fandom? Or is it actually a solid game that was just never really given a chance? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 18th in a series of videos where I'm playing every Metal Gear game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along in preparation for the release of Metal Gear Solid Delta later this year. And while you don't have to have seen the rest of my videos in order to enjoy this one, you will be missing a lot of important context about my journey with the series if you haven't seen them, so I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you who want to go check those out first. But with that out of the way, Metal Gear Survive is a zombie survival game developed and published by Konami for the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC in 2018. In this game, we play as the Captain, an MSF soldier who was killed when XOF attacked Mother Base during the events of Ground Zeroes, but who was mysteriously revived by a group known as Wardenclyffe Section shortly afterwards. The game opens with a man inspecting the bodies of those who fell during the Mother Base attack, and when he eventually comes to our casket, he says that it's good to see us again and asks us to forgive him for what he's about to do. We're then brought to the character creator, and this thing has basically been carried straight over from MGS5. So just to make things a little more interesting for this playthrough, I decided to just recreate the avatar that I made for Venom during my MGS5 run, and headcanon that he actually had a twin brother who joined MSF along with him back during the events of Peace Walker. A twin who has the exact same scars as him and everything. Look, just let me have this, okay? Once we're done there, we cut back to the mysterious man looking at a picture of us, saying that we're the key to everything, and placing the picture in the casket alongside us. Our casket is then shut, and we're buried at sea along with the other fallen soldiers. However, the picture had a GPS tracker attached to it, and were recovered shortly afterwards and brought into an unknown facility. Another man in the facility says that we're infected, to which the man who brought us in tells him that that makes us the perfect candidate to send into the gates of hell. The other man doesn't love the idea, but says that he'll get the section on board and walks out of the room before the screen fades to black. We then fade back in, waking up underneath some sort of wormhole and finding ourselves surrounded by wreckage. The mysterious man speaks to us through a nearby camera, telling us that we've descended into hell and that this place is called Dite. He tells us to head for a nearby camp, sending us off on our own to find our way there. We get our first stretch of gameplay here, and fans of MGS5 will immediately notice that Metal Gear Survive is essentially just a standalone expansion of that game. The core gameplay is basically unchanged in terms of controls and movement mechanics, and the world of Dite is almost entirely made up of reused assets from the Afghanistan map of the Phantom Pain. After only a couple minutes of walking around, we come into contact with some enemies that the mysterious man refers to as Wanderers. These Wanderers are simply other people like us who have found their way into Dite somehow and become infected by an unknown life form that's native to it. As we're running away from them, we're saved by another soldier who somehow managed to survive, and the mysterious man butts into our conversation to introduce himself as Good Luck and answer some of our questions. He explains to us that Dite is a dimension completely separate from our own, and that if we work with him, he'll be able to get us out of there. We don't exactly love the idea of it, but Good Luck seems to be our only lifeline here, so we do what he says and work together with the other soldier to reach the camp that he mentioned earlier. We don't have anything on hand to defend ourselves with though, so here, we get introduced to Metal Gear Survive's crafting system. As you play the game, you're going to come across various loose materials pretty much everywhere you go, and these materials can be used to craft various items. For example, during this tutorial section, we grab some iron and some rags that we find around the room, and use them to make a pipe spear for self-defense. This is the first of Survive's, well, survival systems. Along with that, every weapon that you craft will have a durability stat, meaning that you can only use the weapon a limited number of times before it will break. You can repair the weapon by using a small amount of the materials you used to originally craft it, and while this system might seem like a pain in the ass, it's honestly not that bad. The durability on weapons is really high in this game, with even this first pipe spear being able to attack enemies up to 500 times before breaking. So don't worry, it's not like you're playing Breath of the Wild where you find this awesome weapon and then get to use it like 10 times before it's gone. And last but not least, you can invest more materials into your weapons to upgrade them, increasing their attack power and their durability stats. This one's pretty plain and simple. If you like a weapon and you have the materials, you can just toss them on there to make the weapon even better and more reliable. The crafting systems don't do anything you haven't seen a million times before, but it all does a good job at giving the game a solid progression system, so I would say I like it well enough. As we make our way to the camp, we get a flashback to the Mother Base attack where we see a giant wormhole open up over the top of the base and start sucking everyone inside. The captain manages to grab onto something and prevent himself from being pulled in, even trying to catch other MSF soldiers and prevent them from going through as he can. However, one of the men we managed to catch is still slowly being pulled into the wormhole and is about to take us in with him. But just as he gets pulled in and we're about to go through as well, the wormhole closes and we drop back onto Mother Base. So if it wasn't clear up to this point, no, this game is definitely not canon. The wormhole opens up just after Big Boss's chopper is taking back off after picking up Kazuhira Miller, so if the game was canon, we definitely would have seen the wormhole back in Ground Zeroes. So just to make it abundantly clear for those of you who are really into the Metal Gear storyline, this game has no effect on anything outside of itself. After this flashback, we then get another flashback where Good Luck is giving us our briefing just before sending us into Dite. He explains to us that after the wormhole opened up above Mother Base, they sent a manned expedition team into Dite called the Charon Corps. He tells us that they lost all contact with the Corps a while ago, so now they're sending us in to recover the research data they left behind, as well as rescue any Charon Corps survivors that we might come across while doing so. With our objectives laid out to us, we then cut back to the present, where we arrive at the Charon Corps' base camp along with Reeve. When we do, an AI pod just like the one in Peace Walker flies in and plants itself in the base, introducing itself to us as Virgil AT9. Good Luck explains over the radio that she was originally the Charon Corps' support AI, but that now she'll be our main source of support on our mission. Good Luck can only contact us so long as the wormhole back home stays open, so when it closes, we'll have to rely on Virgil to get us through the mission. And conveniently, just as that piece of info is explained to us, the wormhole back home starts closing and we lose contact with Good Luck. Virgil then explains to us that in order to get home, we'll need to activate a device the Charon Corps brought with them called the Wormhole Digger, but that we currently don't know where it is. She also warns us of what she calls the Dust, which is a massive dust cloud that covers the majority of Dite that is incredibly toxic to humans. She tells us that without some sort of countermeasure, it will be impossible for us to enter and operate within the dust, so we'll have to avoid it for the time being. With all that now being explained to us though, we head out into the world of Dite to find the research the Charon Core left behind. And with us now being able to explore the world freely, the first priority is to find some food and water so we don't die of malnourishment. When your hunger is below 90% full, your maximum health will start to slowly decrease relative to how much hunger you have left. The same thing will happen if your thirst is below 90%, it'll just affect your stamina bar instead of your health bar. And if either of these hit 0%, you'll start losing health rapidly and you'll need to find something to eat or drink to make sure that you don't die. If you ask me, making it so that players start to lose their maximum health or stamina values after falling below 90% full is a bit ridiculous. You have to be eating and drinking food pretty much constantly if you want to stay above 90%, so you'll probably notice pretty quickly that I almost never had my full health or stamina bars available to me during my playthrough, since I quite frankly just couldn't be bothered to open up the menus and eat or drink every 1 or 2 minutes. Aside from that though, finding food is incredibly simple. All you have to do is find something like berries in random bushes, or hunt the various animals you come across to harvest their meat. Of course, if you do decide to hunt animals, you'll need to bring the meat back to base camp and cook it before eating it, or you'll risk getting some pretty nasty viruses or food poisoning. Finding water can be a little more complicated though. There's no shortage of empty bottles and dirty water all over the open world, but much like eating uncooked meat, drinking this dirty water means taking the risk of getting seriously sick. So you'll have to boil the water you collect in order to make it clean, but the campfire back at base doesn't have a pot or anything that you can do that with. You can eventually replace your campfire with one that allows you to boil water, but during my playthrough, it took about 4 hours of gameplay to get to that point, meaning that clean water was a rarity for quite a while. Basically, the only way you can get it during these early hours is to be lucky enough to just come across bottles that already have clean water in them. I don't know why the designers didn't allow players to just use some iron or something to make a pot for the campfire earlier in the game, but maybe they just wanted to make you feel like you were struggling to find clean drinking water so you would better appreciate being able to make it for yourself later on. Whatever the reason, if you decide to check out the game for yourself, you better get used to the idea of drinking dirty water and just hoping you'll be fine. And if you do end up getting sick at any point, you can simply open up the cure menu in order to treat yourself. That's right, the cure menu from Metal Gear Solid 3 makes a return here. As you play, you might become sick from eating bad food or become injured from combat, and when you do, you can use the cure menu to treat the wound or illness, assuming you have the appropriate medical item needed to do so. These items can be found out in the field or crafted by players at a workbench back at base camp. It's not something that really affects the gameplay too much, but I definitely thought it was worth mentioning just because I know how much the Metal Gear fandom loved this system back in MGS3. As you explore the open world though, more and more of the map will slowly be marked on your iDroid, and as you go, you can also place down stamps to mark what you found in each area. So if you find a spot where animals spawn and you can hunt for food, you can mark that on your map in case you need to find it later. The same idea applies for if you find somewhere with clean water, rare materials, whatever it might be. It actually makes exploring the open world a lot more enjoyable than I had expected, as those discoveries feel even more valuable when you can throw down a marker and come back to that spot every couple hours or so to gather the materials again. Finding the right resources in survival games is always a huge make or break for your playthrough, so being able to mark where all those materials can be found is a great addition here. Shortly after our arrival at base camp, the game also teaches us how to craft defense units, and these are a huge part of the game. These defense units are things like fences or barriers that can be placed down anywhere you want as you explore in order to slow down the wanderers, or even funnel them all into one place to deal with them more easily. As you get further into the game, you can even work your way up to being able to place down lethal traps or mounted machine guns, meaning that there's a good amount of progression associated with these as well. I'm sure that all of you have seen those legendary clips floating around of someone sitting behind a fence and poking wanderers with a spear, and these units are where those clips come from. Like I said, they're super important to the game, so I'll probably be mentioning them at least a couple more times throughout the video. And now would probably be a good time to cover the game's general currency. All enemies in Metal Gear Survive carry a small amount of Kuban energy that can be looted from their bodies after you've defeated them, and this Kuban energy acts as the replacement for things like GMP from previous games. Every time you want to craft a weapon or a defense unit, or really do just about anything in Survive, you'll have to spend a certain amount of Kuban energy in order to do so. There are some other ways of collecting Kuban energy later on, so I'll make sure to mention those as we get to them. For now though, just remember that Kuban energy is essentially the most important resource in the game. Something else I've neglected to mention up to this point is how they've worked stealth into the game. I'm not sure if you've noticed it yet, but the Wanderers have all lost the majority of their heads due to the large spike that grows out of their neck after they're infected. As a result of this, they're barely able to see the player, relying on senses other than sight to figure out where you are. To take advantage of this, you can simply sneak around the Wanderers if you don't want to spend any of your resources engaging them, or you can go up behind them for a silent takedown. If you opt for the silent takedown, you'll stab the crystallized lump on the back of their neck that acts as their brains, and there will be a short time before they die where you can send them back to base camp through a mini wormhole in order to harvest extra Kuban energy from them. This is actually a pretty solid way to integrate Metal Gear's trademark stealth gameplay into this totally new experience, as the stealth isn't necessary to engage with, but you're rewarded with faster progression through the game if you take the time to do so. I personally took the stealthy approach more often than not, and felt very rewarded as a result, so I think it's been implemented pretty well here, all things considered. Back to the main story though, like I mentioned earlier, we spend these early chapters going around and gathering the data that the Charon Core left behind after they disappeared. Every time you reach one of the data terminals they left behind and download the files from them, you'll also find new cassette tapes that you can listen to from members of the Core, detailing what was going on during their mission and fleshing out the backstory of the game. These vary quite a bit in terms of how interesting they are, and the voice acting can be pretty hit or miss in them, but they aren't the only reward you get for seeking out these data caches. When you download their research, you'll also learn how to craft new items, especially new buildings and workstations back at base camp. Which brings us to the construction and management aspects of your camp. Shortly after the beginning of the game, you'll be given the ability to customize base camp's layout, as well as build new workstations and such as you please. You can upgrade the benches for crafting gear, allowing you to craft new, previously unavailable items. You can throw down some farms that will passively grow food as you go out and explore Dite, and even place down defense units to keep base camp safe from attacking Wanderers. Base camp may have been a mess when we initially found it, but believe me when I tell you that by the end of the game, I had turned it into a little piece of heaven within this hellscape. And I actually really loved doing so. Part of what made games like Peace Walker and the Phantom Pain so enjoyable for me was slowly building up Mother Base throughout the game and seeing that progression as I go along. But here, not only did I get to see that progression, but I actually got to customize the base myself, only giving me an even stronger sense of accomplishment for doing so. Once the game is finished introducing all of these new systems and mechanics to you, it finally lets you off the leash and allows you to go explore the open world without any sort of hand-holding or tutorials. And you guys might want to brace yourselves for what I'm about to say, make sure you're sitting down and everything. But once it finally does, it's kind of fun. Don't get me wrong, it's far from the most fun game I've played recently or anything like that, but it's weirdly a lot more enjoyable than it looks. Anytime you go out to explore Dite, there will be one main mission available to progress the story with, along with a handful of side missions that pop up between every main story chapter. The side missions are always incredibly simple and mostly serve as a way for the designers to guide the players to important resources like large animals to hunt or large deposits of Kuban energy to harvest. There's this almost relaxing quality to just heading out into the world to gather some resources and maybe do a mission or a side mission before returning to base camp, upgrading your gear or your camp, and then returning back to the open world to do it all over again. It's a surprisingly pleasant gameplay loop, but as we'll come back to later, I'm not really sure if it does enough to keep itself interesting for an entire playthrough. After collecting some more Charon Core data though, we gain the ability to use the skill trainer back at camp. This is essentially a chamber that you can enter that allows you to invest Kuban energy into increasing your character's level. With each level that you purchase, you'll earn one skill point that you can then spend anywhere on this little skill tree that you like. Some of these are incredibly straightforward, like increasing your melee damage or your max health value, but some of these open up entirely new abilities that you didn't have before, like a dodge move or a leg sweep takedown to use in combat. It's a super basic skill tree, and while it doesn't do anything all that remarkable, it's just one more thing that makes players feel rewarded for putting the time in to survive. Also, with this particular set of data, Virgil manages to pick out a crafting recipe for an air tank, and crafting it will allow players to actually venture into the dust. Like Virgil mentioned earlier, the dust covers the majority of Dite, and venturing inside of it is considerably more dangerous than anything we've done up to this point in the game. The dust has way more wanderers roaming around inside of it, and since our air tank can only carry so much oxygen for us, we can only spend so much time inside of the dust per expedition. If your oxygen runs out while you're still inside, you'll slowly suffocate to death, so players need to be mindful of how much longer they can stay in the dust, and when they need to start moving back to base camp. And I'm sure you've noticed and don't need me to tell you, but the visibility inside the dust is also incredibly limited, with it basically looking like you're playing an old Silent Hill game whenever you're in there. To take that oppressive feeling even further, whenever you're in an area of the dust that you haven't explored yet, you'll actually lose your connection to base camp's navigation systems. This means that if you were trying to follow a marker to get to your next objective, you're going to lose it as soon as you enter an area that you haven't charted out yet, and you'll be running around blindly in there. So if you're going to do a lot of trips into the dust, you better hope that you have a good sense of direction. But to offset this danger, the dust also contains much more valuable rewards than the rest of the world. You'll find much higher concentrations of Kuban energy, more rare materials that you won't come across anywhere else, and most importantly, these locked containers that were left behind by the Charon Core. Almost every single one of these locked containers holds a new crafting recipe for things like weapons or gear, meaning that seeking out every last one of them that you can is incredibly worthwhile. Finding all of them might sound like a pain in the ass considering the visibility inside the dust, but they actually have these incredibly bright blue lights on them, so whenever you see one of those blue lights off in the distance while you're adventuring in the dust, you know that there's a container over there that you haven't unlocked yet. I honestly really like what they've done with the dust, which probably isn't all that surprising given how much I normally love risk-reward systems like this. Regardless, I'm a big fan of the dust, and I would probably say that it's one of the most interesting parts of the game. Something that I really don't enjoy in this game though is the weight limit. As you might imagine, the captain can only carry so much gear on him at one time, but in a game that has you pretty much constantly picking up various supplies and items, the weight limit becomes an annoyance very early on. The game doesn't strictly keep you from going over 100% of your carry limit, but if you do hit 100%, you'll lose the ability to sprint entirely, meaning you'll have to walk the whole way back to base camp. However, if you continue to pick up more gear past the 100% mark, your walking will be slowed down considerably, making it so that you're essentially crouch walking back to base from there. And if you, for whatever reason, continue to pick up items beyond that point, you'll lose the ability to move entirely and be forced to leave some things behind in order to get back to base. Like I said, you'd expect something like this to be here, but this game's progression so heavily revolves around collecting all the resources you come across in the world of Dite, so the weight limit just artificially forces you to take more trips back to base camp as you're progressing, and pads out the game's length as a result. Eventually though, we come to another data terminal of the Charon cores, but this time, we also find the dead body of one of the members in the room with it. What's peculiar though is that this member wasn't killed by exposure to the dust or even the Wanderers, but rather they've suffered a number of gunshot wounds. So unless there are Wanderers out there that have learned how to use weapons, he would have to have been killed by another human. And this was the first point in the story where my interest was piqued a little bit. Up to this point, Survive seemed to have an incredibly bare bones and cookie cutter story, but with us now having found this body, it seemed like it might just have all the deception and intrigue that we've come to love from the series. Once we bring this data back to Virgil though, she's able to reactivate the wormhole transporter back at base camp. With this now being active again, we're able to go and find other wormhole transporters throughout the dust that we can activate to open up fast travel points throughout the world. But I really want to emphasize, all of these transporters are located within the dust, and there's a good reason for that. As I said earlier, players can only spend so much time inside of the dust before they start to suffocate from a lack of oxygen. So these transporters essentially act as checkpoints that you can use to venture further and further into the dust as the game goes on. So just due to the nature of the dust, it makes a simple fast travel system more interesting than it otherwise would be. On top of that, activating these transporters takes some time and also gives off a large Kuban energy signature that draws Wanderers to your location. So in order to activate a wormhole transporter, you'll have to set up some defenses and keep the Wanderers from attacking it for a short time, usually something like 2 to 3 minutes. And holdouts like this are where I really started to enjoy the defensive units, as it's honestly really fun to know that there are hordes of enemies coming and set up your defenses to try to keep them out. It's almost like you're playing a tower defense game where you're actually one of the units, and it's weirdly satisfying despite how boring it can look when you see gameplay of someone just poking zombies through a fence. While we're in the process of testing out the wormhole transporters, we see a large wormhole suddenly open up in the sky. A helicopter then appears that's already spiraling out of control, and it crashes down somewhere inside of the dust. Virgil tells us that we might be able to find some valuable supplies, or maybe even some survivors, so we head off to find the wreckage and see what we can salvage from it. When I get there, there isn't really much to be found, but there is one nurse who seems to have survived the crash, so I carry her out of there and get her back to base camp as quickly as I can. And with her back at base, Virgil recommends that we start assigning crew members to certain roles around the camp to keep everything running smoothly. This crew management ends up being very similar to what we saw back in games like Peace Walker or the Phantom Pain. For now, we can only assign members to the base development team, which manages our agricultural units in the camp, such as farms or water collection tanks. The higher the level of your base development team, the more efficient these units will become, leading to more food being available not just to you, but for everyone in the camp to survive off of. With each new survivor that you add to the camp, you'll need to make sure that you can provide enough food, water, medical supplies, and a place to sleep in order to sustain them. So having things back at camp like a potato farm, a medical herb farm, or a water collection tank can lead to you having more food, medical supplies, or water available for these survivors respectively. A little later into the game, you'll also gain access to more teams to assign crew members to, like the exploration and the medical teams. The medical team is pretty straightforward, just being in charge of treating injuries or illnesses around base camp, but the exploration team is a lot more interesting. These guys essentially act as a replacement for the dispatch missions we saw back in MGS5. You can send members of your exploration team out to gather resources or Kuban energy, hunt for animals, things like that. Much like the dispatch missions, these expeditions all have a certain amount of real-world time that has to pass before they're complete, but these times are much more extreme in Metal Gear Survive than they were in MGS5. See, all of the in-game timers in Survive actually continue running whether you're playing the game or not, so instead of having timers that go as high as 2 hours like the Phantom Pain, there are timers that go upwards of 24 hours here. This meant that for someone like me, I wasn't able to get much out of the exploration team while binging through the game in like 4 days for this video, but if you play the game like a normal human being, it might not be much of an issue. Either way, it kind of bothers me to have timers that long, and I haven't even brought up the worst part yet. If you play the game normally, you'll only ever have access to one exploration team crew that you can send out at once. You can unlock up to 5 of them, but this is done using Metal Gear Survive's premium in-game currency, meaning if you want to make full use of your exploration team, you'll have to pay some extra money on top of what you spent to buy the game. As with most systems like this, it is possible to earn the currency without paying for it, but during my entire 28-hour playthrough, I only ended up earning 40 of the 1,000 coins needed to purchase an additional exploration unit. Out of curiosity, I went to look at how much you would need to pay to get all 5 of them without grinding a few hundred hours away, and what I found was just, oh man. Also, like you'd expect from a premium currency system, you can't just purchase the flat 1,000 coins needed to unlock an additional unit. You'll have to either buy 2 600 coin bundles or one 1,150 coin bundle. This is done frequently in the industry because if you have a little bit of premium currency left over, you'll feel like it would be a waste not to use it, and you'll be much more likely to make additional purchases beyond the one you wanted in order to get all the value out of the money you've already put in. Oh, and by the way, if you were to purchase all 4 additional exploration units for the full price of 4,000 premium coins, the cheapest way to do that would be by paying for 4 of those 1,150 coin bundles, which would cost you a total of $40 US. And after that, you'd have 600 coins left over, so you can't just let those sit in your account and not get put towards anything, right? If I haven't made it obvious enough, I absolutely hate that there are predatory microtransactions included in a game that you would have paid $40 for at the time of its release, but I laid out the entirety of it for you like that so you can come to your own conclusion instead of just echoing my thoughts on it. Getting back to the story though, when I started to get more crew members into the camp, I realized more and more over time that the characters in this game are pretty rough. There are a couple good ones here, but the majority of the cast just feels really bland, and the voice acting actually made me physically cringe a couple times because it just feels so unbelievably forced.
I overheard your little power. Seth pulled a fast one on you guys too, huh? What do you say I lend you a hand?
So yeah, aside from a couple of specific characters, you might notice that the rest of my story breakdown is pretty centered on the plot itself rather than the people within it, and that's just because frankly, the characters just don't give you a whole lot to latch onto here. Anyway, we get back to, you guessed it, going out and finding more data from the Charon core. I eventually come across this large ruined building inside the dust that's supposed to have a terminal inside, so I go through it, find the terminal, and download the data to my iDroid. Just as I leave the building to head back to camp though, I'm met by the sight of this absolute behemoth of a creature roaming past. Virgil tells us to not engage with it with our current weapons and to just sneak by it and return to base camp. I do so, and when we bring the data back to Virgil, it conveniently turns out that that data terminal was storing all of the info on the large creature we just saw. The Charon Corps called it the Lord of Dust, and their records say that multiple members of theirs were killed by it. But luckily, we might not have to worry about that for very long, because this terminal also contained the coordinates that the Corps last left the wormhole digger at, meaning that we can now make our way over there and secure it so we can get back home. And from this point on in the game, there's a solid chance that you'll randomly encounter the Lord of Dust while you're exploring the dusts, as it's constantly just roaming around in there as you play. I never had it attack me or anything, but it was always really cool to see this gigantic monster just emerge out of the fog and start shaking the ground with its heavy footsteps. It really adds a lot to the atmosphere of the dust and gives you this uneasy feeling that there might be more monsters like that hiding in the fog that you just haven't encountered yet. Getting back on track though, we go and retrieve the wormhole digger, bringing it back to base camp so Virgil can activate it and open up a wormhole back home for us. While Virgil is working on opening up the wormhole though, it becomes unstable and starts opening a bunch of smaller wormholes all around base camp. A ton of wanderers then start emerging from these smaller wormholes, and we end up needing to defend the wormhole digger much like we do for the transporters when we're activating those. This holdout is much more intense though, as not only is it 7 minutes long, meaning you need to find a way to make your supplies last through the entire thing, but the wanderers are also attacking our home base rather than just some random camp we found inside the dust. It really adds a new intensity to this holdout, knowing that if the wanderers manage to get through your defenses, they'll start destroying everything you've been working towards throughout the game. This is also one of the first times in the game that we see a new type of wanderer known as the bomber. These guys have a massive head that's full of volatile Kuban energy and a heavily armored body outside of their legs. If they happen to get close to any defenses you've set up, the Kuban energy inside their head will explode, instantly destroying any defenses that are remotely close to them. Seeing one of these bombers spawn during a holdout immediately shifts the dynamic of the entire thing, as you suddenly have to play aggressively rather than defensively to ensure that they don't tear open a massive hole in your defenses. All things considered, this is easily the best holdout in the game up to this point, and might just be a positive sign of things to come. After we've made it through those 7 minutes though, the wormhole Virgil was working on suddenly closes, and we're told that there wasn't enough energy going towards the digger to successfully open up a wormhole home. Virgil then tells us that if we want to get back home, we'll have to find a higher purity form of Kuban energy known as Iris energy. She says that she was under the impression the digger would have enough energy to open up the wormhole, but that it would now seem that her data on the wormhole digger had been tampered with somehow. Reeve asks who would do such a thing before an unknown voice comes over the radio telling us that it was likely Good Luck. The voice introduces himself as Joseph Gruen and tells us that he's in charge of the DT research program. The wormhole that we opened is just big enough for him to communicate with us for a short amount of time, and he tells us that Good Luck has been relieved of his duties due to his repeated violation of orders. He further explains that our mission here in DT was entirely Good Luck's doing, and that Wardenclyffe's section never sanctioned any of it. He says that Good Luck likely wanted to use us to secure the Charon Corps' data for himself, but his plan failed, so now Gruen is in charge of getting us home as soon as possible. Before the wormhole closes, he sends over what little information they got back from the Corps before they disappeared, saying that if we look through it, we might be able to find some information on singularities containing Iris energy. After that though, the wormhole fully closes, and we're cut off from him once again. From this point on, our top priority is to return home from DT, and for now, using the wormhole digger to collect Iris energy is the best way to do that. So we go to the singularity that was marked in the Charon Core's data to dig up the iris energy within it. And this introduces us to another new, even larger scale holdout than the previous ones. When digging for iris energy, you'll be placed in an area with a large number of spawn points surrounding it. The routes that the wanderers will take from their spawn points to the wormhole digger will then be highlighted for you so you can prepare your defenses accordingly. And instead of being one 2 to 3 minute holdout, these will instead have multiple waves of wanderers that are between 2 and 4 minutes long apiece, with a small amount of time in between them. During the downtime between waves though, you'll have to frantically set up more defenses, as the spawn points and routes of the wanderers will change with every new wave. Much like what we saw before, this is just the team at Konami slowly ramping up the intensity of the defensive holdouts as you get further into the game. Smaller scale versions of these digs can also be found in the open world as side missions that offer large amounts of Kuban energy for being completed, as well as the chance of getting some pretty rare crafting materials from them. So overall, it's a nice evolution of the holdouts that we've seen up to this point, and help to make the game a little more interesting. Also at this point in the game, things like new containers and even walker gears will start appearing in the dust after being brought in by new wormholes. So as the game goes on, more crafting recipes become available with these new containers, and if you can find them out in the open world, you can also make use of walker gears on occasion to help make things like iris energy digs much easier. The walker gears do still have a limited amount of ammunition, and they also can't last for very long within the environment of the dust. This is actually true of any vehicle you might come across in Metal Gear Survive, as being inside of the dust will slowly damage them to the point where they're unusable. Walker gears are no different, ensuring that if you do find one, you can only make use of it for a few minutes before it's disabled again. Allowing players to use walker gears was a really fun addition, but I do wish that there were more variants available, as I only ever found walker gears with generic machine guns during my playthrough. It's a ton of fun to blast through hordes of wanderers with a machine gun in one of these, but knowing what kind of weapons were available for D-Walker back in MGS5, I really can't help but wish we could find variants with things like flamethrowers equipped to them as well. Aside from little additions or changes like that though, not much really changes in terms of gameplay from this point. Which brings us to what I believe is Survive's largest problem, its repetition and lack of variety. I really do feel like most of Metal Gear Survive's gameplay is far from being bad. In fact, it can be pretty fun once it gets going, but it's just not the sort of game that can stay that fun for 20 to 30 hours. You can only hunt so many animals, backstab so many wanderers, and defend so many dig sites before you start to feel the monotony kicking in. I found myself really pleasantly surprised in the first few hours of the game, but for the last few hours, I found myself sitting there just waiting for it to end. Something that certainly doesn't help is that the pacing in this game is really poor due to how much there is to grind out between major progression points. You fall into this loop of getting a bunch of new gear to play around with, spending 2 or 3 hours just going around and grinding out all these open world activities, and then you'll finally hit the jackpot and get a ton of new gear again before the cycle repeats itself. The progression is really satisfying when it's working here, but there are just really long gaps of time between those points where you feel genuinely rewarded for your efforts. It's this crazy roller coaster where you get really excited about all this new stuff you have to play with and have fun with all of it for like an hour or so, but then just spend another hour or two being bored while you wait to get some more new stuff. It would definitely help to give little breadcrumbs of progression constantly, rather than having these massive unlock points that are spread throughout the main story, as it would give players more motivation to actually continue to grind out all the activities they come across in Dite. As we're exploring Dite though, we suddenly find a child stranded in a ruined building. So we bring him back to base camp, and when he wakes up, we learn that his name is Chris. He has no memory of how he got here, and suddenly starts to panic because he doesn't have his wheelchair. So the captain decides to do his good deed for the day and goes out to find some parts that we can make him a wheelchair out of. While we're doing so, we come across more of the Charon Core's data, which just so happens to contain the location of another singularity. So after we get back to base camp and make Chris a new wheelchair, we head back out to dig that singularity for its iris energy. This is another holdout that's basically identical to the last singularity, and once that's done and we have the energy we need, we head back to base camp to open up a wormhole home. As expected though, the wormhole we open once again becomes unstable, leading to another holdout where we have to defend base camp from wanderers while it stabilizes. Once we've finished up with the holdout, the wormhole is just past 90% complete, and Virgil tells us that it will be totally stable momentarily. With it mostly being open now, Gruen is able to contact us again, but he warns us that we need to increase the power output on the wormhole digger or the wormhole generation will fail again. Virgil tells him that her calculations show the current power output will be sufficient, but he reveals that Goodluck secretly installed a black box in Virgil before sending her into Dite that's influencing her ability to process information. He reminds us that Goodluck's tampering already prevented us from getting home once, to which Virgil says that she would like to speak to Goodluck herself. Gruen says that that won't be possible though, revealing that Goodluck has already taken his own life. He says that he won't let anyone else suffer because of Goodluck's actions, telling us once again to increase the wormhole digger's power output to its maximum. Virgil warns us that increasing it will be very dangerous, but we listen to Gruen regardless and increase the power output. After doing so, the wormhole fully stabilizes, and we all prepare to go through and get ourselves home. Just then though, the ground starts shaking, and we see that the Lord of Dust has emerged from the dust and is heading towards base camp. We frantically run up through the ruins of Mother Base to reach the wormhole, with us barely managing to make it inside before the Lord of Dust absorbs all the energy that's keeping it open. When we all wake up, we seem to be back on Earth, but we quickly realize that we still seem to be somewhere inside of Dite. Virgil then plays a message from Goodluck for us, where he welcomes us to the next circle and tells us that our journey isn't over yet. He explains that we didn't do anything wrong and that we've ended up exactly where he wanted us to. He then reveals that everything he put into motion with these missions of his was all to allow us to kill the Lord of Dust, saying that there's a survivor from the Charon Core somewhere in the area who holds the key to destroying it. He says that he's counting on the captain before the message cuts off, and Virgil says that she thinks she understands why Gruen wanted us to increase the power output of the wormhole digger. She says that the level of output we used was completely unnecessary, and he was likely trying to trick us into creating a wormhole large enough to attract the Lord of Dust to it so they could lure it back to Earth and use it to create a new energy source. And again, man, this sort of deception and double crossing wasn't something I had expected Metal Gear Survive to have, but I'm really happy that it does, as things start getting pretty interesting around this point. Anyway, we don't really have any other options, so we go out to explore this new area and see if we can find that survivor that Goodluck was talking about. This new area is actually an entire second world map, and much like how the first map was made up mostly of assets from MGS5's Afghanistan, this map is made up of MGS5's Africa assets. Because of this, there's much thicker vegetation throughout the entirety of the second map, which, along with the heavy fog present in the dust, makes visibility pretty rough here. There's a ton of new enemy types here as well. The first, and possibly the most annoying of these, are the grabbers. These are some weird kind of bug wanderers that burrow into the ground, and if you walk anywhere near them, they'll actually grab your leg and hold you in place temporarily while raising the alert for other nearby wanderers. The best way to deal with these guys is to keep a close eye out for them and use something like a bow to shoot and kill them before they ever have the chance to grab you and pop out of the ground. Then there's the trackers. These are essentially just super beefed up versions of the basic wanderers who can move much faster, make massive leaps around the map, and deal much more damage than your basic wanderer as well. And last, but certainly not least, there's the mortars. These are mega beefed up wanderers that have heavy armor on one side of their body, as well as a gigantic arm that they can use to shoot explosive projectiles, as well as machine gun fire at you. And God help you if you ever have a bunch of mortars show up when you're trying to defend an objective, because if they manage to gang up on you like that, there will be explosions and bullets flying legitimately everywhere. These enemies are all great additions to the game that help a lot with breaking up the monotony of the core gameplay loop, but what I don't understand is why the designers waited until this point in the game to introduce them. I mean, seriously, this is a game that really struggles with its gameplay becoming monotonous and repetitive, and they wait until like the 75% complete mark to introduce more than 2 enemy types. There are a couple of other unique enemy types that show up before this point in the game, but they're both specific to one main story mission in one specific location, so out of the roughly 18 hours I had played up to this point, those enemies were present for maybe like 4 minutes of them. I seriously just can't wrap my head around why these enemies weren't spread throughout the campaign more evenly, but at least they're here now, I guess. As we're adapting to the new environment, we come across a ruined building with a man inside. We see another man with a shotgun walk in and tell the one on the floor that he's going to make him suffer, and just then, our left arm starts glowing, blowing our cover and causing the man with the shotgun to flee. Once he's gone, we walk in to find that the man on the floor is actually the same one we tried to save from the wormhole during the attack on MSF. So of course, we take him back to the FOB we're using as a temporary camp, and here we learn that his name is Seth. After he was pulled into the wormhole, he was actually taken in by the Charon Core for a while before they disappeared. He then reveals to us that the core was taken out by the man who we just saw with the shotgun. His name is Dan, and he was actually an engineer who came in with the Charon Core. Seth further explains that being in Dite for too long caused Dan to have a psychotic break before Virgil interrupts him and asks if Seth would be the member of the Charon Core with the key to destroy the Lord of Dust. He tells us that there's a weapon nearby that should be capable of killing it, and that this weapon is called Sahelanthropus. And this got me super excited because even though I understand that Sahelanthropus being here is just another way to reuse assets from the Phantom Pain, the thought of piloting Metal Gear Sahelanthropus in a final battle with the Lord of Dust just had me anxious to get to the ending. So from here, we go to find Sahelanthropus, and after a little over an hour of searching, I managed to find its remains laying in a river. I go to take a look at it and verify that it will be usable before Dan jumps out from behind me and starts asking who I am. Virgil tells him that we're under Goodluck's orders to destroy the Lord of Dust, and also confronts him about killing the rest of the core. He insists that he never killed anybody, and Virgil relays to us that based on observing his reactions so far, she believes that he's still completely mentally sound. Which is another really interesting thing for her to say, because if that were true, it would mean that Seth was lying to us earlier. Hearing us mention Seth makes Dan really angry, but we're suddenly ambushed by Wanderers, and he runs away so he doesn't get killed. We stand our ground and fight off the Wanderers, but are ultimately left wondering who to trust between Seth and Dan. We don't really have much time to dwell on it though, so we take a quick trip back to the FOB to resupply before returning to Sahelanthropus and using the wormhole digger to send it back to base camp. And doing so is by far the most challenging thing in the game up to this point, as we get a 15.5-minute holdout with no waves or breaks of any sort. It might seem like this would get boring because of how long it goes on for, but trust me, the sheer intensity of trying to ensure that your defenses and supplies last against over 15 minutes of constant enemy spawns will keep you plenty on your toes. By the time I got to the end of the holdout, it was just me, a fire axe, and a couple fences between the Wanderers and Sahelanthropus. And add on to that I had a bleed going that I didn't have enough styptic to patch up, meaning I was completely unable to heal from damage at that point as well. It's an insanely intense holdout, and for me, was easily the highlight of the game up to this point. Once the timer hits 0, Sahelanthropus is sent back to base camp before we suddenly get a call from Reeve telling us that Seth has double-crossed us and taken Chris hostage. Seth tells Virgil that she needs to send him back to base camp or he'll shoot Chris, also demanding that she goes with him and that we're sent to meet him there alone. Virgil complies with his demands, and we then see a scene of Chris and Seth talking after they arrive back at base camp, where Seth reveals to him that he's actually infected and working along with the Wanderer's hive mind. He explains that they call themselves the Dread Dust, and that they began as medical nanomachines back on Earth. Over time, they evolved to be able to infect intelligent life and use their hosts to generate a highly efficient energy source that we've come to know as Kuban energy. Virgil asks Seth how he retained so much of his humanity, and he simply responds that the Dread Dust determined having a mostly human host like him would be the most efficient way to achieve their goals. He tells Virgil that there's hardly anything left in Dite for them to consume and grow off of, so they want to open a gateway back to Earth so they can harvest and feed off of a whole new world in order to evolve further. Seth then reaches his arm out towards Virgil, somehow pulling the information and codes from her to be able to activate the wormhole digger, and saying that all they need now is the power of Sahelanthropus to open the gateway. Back at the FOB though, we and the other survivors are trying to figure out how to take base camp back from Seth, and as we're trying to come up with ideas, Dan walks up. He says that he has a way to get us out of the bad spot we're in, and reveals that it was actually Seth who killed the Charon Core and not him. He explains that he has a transporter control program that he made before the core was wiped out, allowing us to use the wormhole transporters without Virgil needing to set the destination for us. So using that, we come up with a plan for Reeve to teleport to a transporter outside of base camp, but still pretty close to it. Then we can go in like normal and wait for Reeve to ambush Seth while he's distracted. So Reeve goes through the transporter, and after we've set the location to base camp, we step through to confront Seth. When we get there, he reaches his arm out to us and causes our infection to start reacting to him. Just then, Reeve jumps out from behind his hiding spot, quickly shooting Seth and grabbing Chris before running away. Seth lays there dead for a few seconds before getting back up and transforming into a large armored wanderer right in front of us, leading into our first boss fight of the game. And a laughably easy one at that. I pull out my shotgun and get close enough to hit his weak spot easily, and after hitting him with exactly 11 shots, managed to end the fight in less than 30 seconds without having taken any damage. Seth falls over and dies just before our arm starts to act up again, and we see visions of the Lord of Dust destroying a major city back on Earth. We pass out next to Seth, and the crew manages to wake us up a few hours later. Virgil tells us that she ran a diagnostic on us while we were out, and she found that the dread dust within us has been reactivated by the contact with Seth, and within a couple weeks, we'll become a wanderer. There is one way to prevent ourselves from turning, and that's by killing the Lord of Dust. Virgil also reveals that she's been infected by the contact with Seth as well, and she'll turn in a similar time frame. Because AIs can apparently be infected by a parasite. However, the contact with Seth also allowed Virgil to process all of the information carried by the dread dust, leading to some pretty wild revelations. The largest of these is that Dite is not a separate dimension, but is actually Earth in the 22nd century. There's only one dimension, and we've simply been put a couple hundred years into the future. Virgil further explains that the world is stuck in a time loop where the Lord of Dust travels back to feed on civilization, wiping everything out and feeding for as long as it can, then traveling back in time again to repeat the cycle. So the only way we can stop the Earth from being destroyed again and escape from this time loop we're stuck in is by destroying the Lord of Dust. However, since the Lord of Dust is the cause of the time loop, destroying it will also mean separating our timeline from the original, which would leave us stranded here in Dite for the rest of our lives. Virgil does have a possible plan though, with her saying that if we can set up a trap using Sahelanthropus, we can all jump back to our time through a wormhole and leave Virgil behind to actually spring the trap and kill it. We have no way of knowing whether this will work or not, but once again, we aren't really left with many other options, so we get to work on setting up a sufficient trap to kill the Lord of Dust with. From this point on, we're able to travel between the two open world maps whenever we want using the wormhole transporters, and I'll simply be referring to them as the Afghanistan map and the Africa map respectively for the sake of simplicity. There are also these new armored wanderers that can be found wandering around both maps. You see what I did there? These guys have much more health than your basic wanderer, and also can't be backstabbed for a silent takedown, but you can sneak up on them to tear their helmets off and open them up for a much quicker kill. All of the other wanderer types from the Africa map can also now appear in the Afghanistan one. Although, it doesn't seem like the grabbers can be found outside of the Africa map, as I never encountered a single one of them in Afghanistan throughout my playthrough. Anyway, we do one last Iris energy dig to gather enough energy for a wormhole back home, then return back to base camp and wait for the other members to finish rigging the Sahelanthropus trap. Once it's complete, Virgil tells us that she recommends that at least one person stays behind to make sure the trap works properly, as the infection is starting to affect her ability to function properly. Pretty much every survivor in the crew then volunteers themselves, saying that they don't feel like they would be able to go back home while some of us are left behind here. We make a group decision that Chris is going back home though, as he's the only child of the group, and Reeve gives him an iDroid containing all the data on the technology we found here to take back with him in the hopes that mankind will someday be able to come back and rescue us. We get everyone into position and start opening up a wormhole, which of course lures the Lord of Dust back to base camp. Just before it reaches the camp though, we use a trap made out of Sahelanthropus' Archaea blade to lock it into place. The captain then puts Chris into the wormhole, who promises that he'll be back for us on his way out, and we run back down to confront the Lord of Dust. This is the final boss fight of the game, but it's more of a boss encounter than a proper boss fight. The Lord of Dust is being held in place by our trap, and we need to defend the trap long enough for it to power back up and fire off again so we can be absolutely sure that it has no way of escaping. So we end up defending the trap for roughly 25 minutes, and this is easily the most chaotic holdout in the game. Knowing that this was the final boss though, I was using everything at my disposal to hold it down, leading to an incredibly frantic, but incredibly fun final defense. I unfortunately didn't get my wish of piloting Sahelanthropus against this giant monster, but the holdout was fun enough, so I wasn't too disappointed. Once the trap is powered back up, we hit the Lord of Dust again, fully locking it into place before running over to Sahelanthropus's remains and firing the railgun off at it. Shortly after this though, the Lord of Dust simply regenerates from the damage and starts sucking up the energy of the wormhole. Virgil then explains to us that there's one issue when trying to kill Dread Dust creatures. Since the Dread Dust was born from nanomachines, they have no concept of their own death, meaning that they will never cease to function as they simply don't understand that there's any reason to. Since wanderers like Seth are made from human hosts, the Dread Dust infecting them inherits the concept of death from the host, allowing it to actually die along with them if the body is destroyed. But for something like the Lord of Dust, it's simply never even had a reason to consider that. Virgil then plays us one final message from Goodluck, where he says that he let us down, and that despite spending 30 years trying to get us out of there, he wasn't able to do it. He says that he remembers going through that wormhole above Mother Base like it was yesterday, revealing himself to actually be Chris. He explains that by using the iDroid we sent him back with, he was able to fake his way into becoming one of the most successful scientists of all time, which he did to be able to rise through the ranks of Wardenclyffe's section and try to get us back home. He tells us that whether or not the time loop is broken depends entirely on our ability to kill the Lord of Dust before the mission ends, and Virgil tells us her plan to destroy it. She explains that she'll become one with the Lord of Dust in order to introduce the concept of death to it so we can actually kill it with the railgun. She then flies directly into the Lord of Dust's mouth and is absorbed by it, allowing us to quickly run back to Sahelanthropus and shoot the head right off the thing, killing it for real this time. And the whole concept of death thing seemed pretty ridiculous to me, but come on guys, this is Metal Gear. This might be one of the weirdest pieces of lore in the franchise, but is it really that far off from vocal cord parasites giving us speech, or fighting against a 100-year-old sniper who keeps himself alive through photosynthesis? Like, it's ridiculous, but the franchise kinda just tends to be, you know? Oh, and by the way, I forgot to write this into the script, but the twist about Goodluck actually being Chris was actually really cool. Ever since the whole time travel thing got introduced, I had this theory that Chris might have been like Goodluck's son who was sent into Detae as punishment, but the reveal that it's actually the same person who's stuck in the time loop with us was honestly just a really good one. Anyway, with the Lord of Dust defeated, we've assumedly broken the time loop and saved the world from endless cycles of destruction, so we head back to camp to rest and celebrate a job well done. As we're hanging out though, Virgil suddenly flies out of the remains of the Lord of Dust and plants herself back in the base, revealing that she's not only survived, but has also retained all sorts of new info about Detae that she got from merging with it. The credits then roll, but of course, it's a Metal Gear game, so we need to have a quick post-credits scene. We hear Goodluck being scolded by Gruen because he had predicted a massive wormhole would open above Mother Base during the battle with XOF, but said wormhole never appeared, confirming that we managed to break the cycle. And going off script again, I can't believe I never realized this sooner, but this game actually could be canon. This game takes place in a world that's doomed to an endless cycle of destruction, but at the end of the game, we've broken the cycle and we get confirmation that the wormhole never opens above Mother Base. So what if the mainline Metal Gear games just take place after this one and we've already broken the time loop? It doesn't mean that it's like canon in the sense of it affects the other games, but they very well could coexist like that. Anyway, with the story now finished, what did I think of it? Well, I do think it had a lot of really fun ideas, but it wasn't super well executed. The double crossing and deception, both within Wardenclyffe's section as well as within our own group of survivors, was great, and I really loved the twist of the world being stuck in an endless time loop, but the story just doesn't do a great job presenting these ideas. Obviously, the story being told predominantly through walls of text with occasional pictures being sprinkled in makes things incredibly boring visually, but beyond that, there's what I mentioned before with the characters. They all feel like super basic cardboard cutouts with barely any personality outside of their 1 or 2 core traits, and the dialogue and voice acting in the game is pretty rough as well. So ultimately, the only character that I really enjoyed in this game was Chris/Goodluck. And even then, I only really enjoy Chris with the hindsight of him being good luck, as when he was just a kid, I actually found him to be pretty uninteresting. I do think there was a lot of potential here, but I just don't think it came together in a way that really lets that potential shine through. So overall, I would say that the story is okay, but just boring for the majority of the game. Before wrapping up the review entirely though, there are a couple more things to talk about. Much like MGS5 and Peace Walker, Metal Gear Survive actually features a surprisingly extensive post-game. There's a ton of new activities available in the open world, like rare animal hunts, the ability to do extra base camp defense holdouts in exchange for large deposits of energy and rare crafting materials, and even a side quest that opens up subclasses. These subclasses can all be leveled up separately, with each of them giving you entirely new abilities that were never available before. I didn't play much of the post-game before wrapping up my playthrough to actually get to working on the video, but these do seem like they all offer pretty unique benefits and likely deepen the gameplay even more, especially when playing in co-op and having multiple people with different subclasses equipped. Speaking of, there are a bunch of co-op missions and activities available once you've finished the game, but saying that the game is dead would be a big understatement, and I wasn't able to find a single match to try any of this stuff out for myself, so I can't personally speak on it. Lastly, there are these new world bosses that you can encounter while you're out exploring, but these guys are super high levels, and I never even managed to get close to killing one of them. These could be really fun to take on if you happen to get super into the game though, so it's nice to have more available here for those that do. And there's one last thing I want to talk about, that being Metal Gear Survive's always online requirement. You quite literally cannot play this game at all if you aren't connected to the servers, meaning that if your internet ever goes out, or the servers have an outage, whatever, you just won't be able to play the game. This also means that when the game's servers inevitably get shut down because it isn't financially worth it for Konami to keep running them, this game will most likely be completely unplayable from that point on. And regardless of what you think of Metal Gear Survive, I do think that this is a game that deserves to be preserved in some way, as even if you despise it, it is a pretty important point in the history of the Metal Gear franchise, so the thought of it being completely lost to time someday is kind of sad. The best thing we can really hope for is that when those servers eventually get shut down, Konami puts some sort of patch out to make the game playable offline, but knowing how Konami typically operates, that's a bit of a stretch to hope for. So on that note, what do I think of Metal Gear Survive overall? Well, my thoughts on the game are very similar to my thoughts on the story. I think that Metal Gear Survive has a lot of good ideas, and is honestly a pretty fun game for a few hours, but a lot of these ideas feel underdeveloped, and the end result is a game that's incredibly repetitive, and honestly just way longer than it should be. And to my surprise, a lot of Survive's issues don't come from laziness or lack of effort from the developers, but just genuinely baffling design decisions. For example, the lack of enemy variety for the majority of the game. The developers took the time to make all these different enemies that you have to approach in different ways, so the effort was there, they just didn't use any of them until the very end of the game for some reason. Ultimately, Metal Gear Survive is far from the worst thing I've ever played, and is probably not even the worst game in the Metal Gear franchise. I mean, Snake's Revenge exists after all, but I definitely think it's among the weakest the series has ever produced. It's definitely not as bad as I had been led to believe it was over the years, but it's just kind of boring. I wish I could have checked out the multiplayer modes, as those were kind of the main selling point of the game, but like I said, there's next to no one playing this game anymore, and it's not really hard to see why. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Metal Gear Survive a 5.9. And that's it, you guys. We've played and reviewed every game in the Metal Gear franchise. It was a long 9 months of work, but it was a worthwhile journey to go on, and I hope that you guys enjoyed the series. We will be moving on to some new things after this video that, as of recording, I literally just finished locking in the plans for this morning, and I'm really excited for what comes next. You guys really made this series possible, since without all of you, I'm just a guy sitting here talking to himself. Especially those of you who are generous enough to contribute to the channel through Patreon or memberships. YouTube ad revenue can be a little inconsistent, so even if you contribute just a small amount, know that it goes a long way in giving me some stability with the channel. I'd love to see you guys hang around for what's coming next, but if not, this was already a massive series, so thank you for even spending this much time watching. And just know that whenever Metal Gear Solid Delta does finally come out, I'll be looking forward to covering it, and you can absolutely expect a video on it from me. Anyway, once again, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll hope to see all of you right here for the next one. Goodbye for now.